Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something called the compound effect, and we're going to use it to bridge the gap between post-colonial African literature and the absolutely defiant, true story of the incredible author Nawal el-Saadawi. Let's get right into it.
So think about this for a second. How do 1,000 invisible, seemingly insignificant cuts ultimately forge or completely destroy a human destiny? It's a pretty heavy thought, right? When we think about dramatic life changes, we usually picture this one huge explosive event. But what we're going to see today is that true transformation, whether we're talking about a fictional character or a real living, breathing person, is actually the result of relentless, compounding actions built up over an entire lifetime.
Now, usually when you hear the phrase compound effect, your brain probably goes straight to finance, right? Like compound interest. Or maybe those self-help books about building daily habits. But today, we're flipping that on its head and looking at it as a literary theory. Basically, it's this concept where multiple, seemingly insignificant actions, choices, or, as we'll see today, traumas build up over time to radically alter someone's destiny. It's the idea that violence isn't just a single event. It's a layered, compounding accumulation that eventually creates an entirely new reality for the person experiencing it.
And this isn't just some abstract idea. There's this fascinating 2023 paper in the Cascades Journal by researcher Juliette Eloquou, and she takes this exact compound effect and applies it directly to post-colonial African literature. Specifically, she analyzes how the buildup of multiple traumas completely transforms, and honestly often shatters, the female characters living in patriarchal societies. We're talking about a process that turns kind-hearted women into isolated, hardened, and sometimes even violent individuals. So how does this actually happen? Well, Eloquou breaks down this compounding trauma into a pretty brutal 5-step escalation. It all starts with structural violence, institutions and legal domination, denying basic rights. Then it layers on physical and sexual violence. Right after that comes psychological violence, which really just installs deep fear. That's followed by emotional violence, things like constant verbal abuse. And finally, the last layer is cultural violence, which includes traumatic traditional practices. You can literally see how each layer stacks right on top of the last, relentlessly compounding the trauma. When you take that framework and apply it to specific characters, the impact is absolutely devastating. Take Firdaus, for example. She's the main character in Nawal el-Saadawi's famous novel Woman Point Zero. Firdaus suffers compounding structural and sexual violence from everywhere: her family, her husband, literally even the police. And all of that eventually forges her into a defiant sex worker who deeply hates men and ultimately commits murder. On the flip side, look at Salamata. From Amadou Kourouma's Les Soleils des Indépendances. Her trauma stems heavily from cultural violence, specifically female genital mutilation and intense psychological abuse. That combination leaves her deeply isolated and genuinely traumatized by the color red. In both of these cases, the compound effect fundamentally rewrites their destinies.
But, okay, here is where our explainer takes a really wild turn from fiction straight into stark reality. The author who actually dreamed up Firdaus, the formidable Egyptian feminist, doctor, and psychiatrist Nawal el-Saadawi, she didn't just invent these compounding forces out of thin air. Not at all. She lived a life profoundly shaped by them. El-Saadawi's own story is literally a masterclass in how compounding acts of systemic oppression can birth a compounding lifetime of radical defiance. Actually, her own life is a terrifying illustration of this exact effect. When she was just 6 years old, she was subjected to female genital mutilation, but she actually suffered childhood amnesia. The trauma was buried deep, deep down in her unconscious. It stayed there until years later when she was a student at Cairo University's medical college. As she began examining other young girls and women who had gone through the exact same procedure, well, the nightmare suddenly flooded right back to her conscious mind. And that realization, it sparked a lifelong radical rebellion against patriarchal structures.
And that realization didn't just linger, it sparked a massive chain reaction of defiance, which, of course, led to compounding consequences. Let's look at the timeline. After earning her medical degree back in 1955, she witnessed the absolute horrors of rural healthcare firsthand and just started writing. By 1972, she published a groundbreaking book called Women and Sex, boldly confronting aggressions against women's bodies. The consequence of that? She was dismissed from her high-ranking position at the Ministry of Health. But she didn't stop. No way. Her activism just kept compounding until 1981, when her fierce criticisms finally landed her in a political prison under President Anwar Sadat. Now, the collision of her reality and her fiction actually happened earlier, in the 1970s. After losing her job at the Ministry of Health, Saadawi took on clinical research looking into neurosis in Egyptian women. This research was crucial because it allowed her to visit inmates at the Konatir Women's Prison, and it was right there, years before her own imprisonment, that she met the real-life female death row inmate who inspired the character Firdaus in Woman at Point Zero. The compounding violence that Saadawi observed in her medical practice was poured directly, unfiltered, into her literature.
So fast forward to when Saadawi herself was locked up in that exact same Konatir prison in 1981. The authorities intentionally denied her pen and paper, but her drive was just unstoppable. Sitting right there in her cell, she managed to record her thoughts using nothing but a smuggled, stubby black eyebrow pencil and a small roll of old, tattered toilet paper. I mean, think about that. Those frantic notes eventually became her famous memoirs from the women's prison. It is just an incredible testament to how attempts to silence her only compounded her determination.
And you know, her rebellion absolutely refused to be contained just to Egypt. It compounded globally. Saadawi viewed the oppression of women as being fundamentally linked to much larger global systems. She founded the Arab Women's Solidarity Association. She vehemently fought against what she saw as the oppressions of global postmodern capitalism and imperialism. In fact, she was imprisoned partly because she opposed the Camp David Agreement with Israel, and she later sharply criticized the US-led war on Afghanistan. For Saadawi, these issues weren't separate. They were all interconnected layers of the exact same overarching systemic violence.
Because of this immense global presence she had, a pretty massive dissonance emerged. Western media often tried to pigeonhole her into this really simple narrative, just a quote-unquote victim of Islam or a generic third world dissident. But Saadawi completely rejected that label. She proudly identified as a socialist feminist, she fiercely embraced her African roots, and she even rejected the term Middle East altogether. She consistently argued that Arab culture was absolutely not inherently inferior to the West, and maintained that capitalism and imperialism were just as responsible for women's subjugation as any local religious fundamentalism.
Now, this lifelong, relentless battle against fundamentalism also led her to some highly controversial stances in her later years. Despite her entire history of fighting authoritarian regimes, she actually defended the government of Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. In a 2015 interview, she said, "There is a world of difference between Mubarak and Sisi. He has got rid of the Muslim Brotherhood." Observers suggest this stance was a really complex result of her lifelong, compounding battle against religious fundamentalists. It really illustrates the incredibly fraught, difficult position of a radical intellectual trying to navigate decades of constantly shifting political landscapes. So when we step back and look at Nawal el-Saadawi, her trauma, her literature, her toilet paper prison diaries, and even her controversial political alliances, we really have to ask ourselves, how do compounding actions shape not just a single life, but the entire history of a society? And what is the immense burden placed on the third world intellectual who tries to navigate and challenge that history on a global stage? It's a powerful, lingering reminder that our actions, no matter how small they seem in the moment, build upon one another, shaping the reality of the world we leave behind. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.